a cannibal, a sex offender, a pedophile, and a serial killer, known as the Milwaukee Cannibal or the Milwaukee Monster. Today we are talking about none other than Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer. Born on May 21st, 1960 in Milwaukee to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. Joyce was on pills while pregnant with Jeffrey, and she was known to be incredibly greedy for attention and very argumentative, especially with her husband and her neighbors, and this created a toxic environment for Jeff and soon his brother, and for Lionel Dahmer. When Dahmer entered the first grade, Lionel was away a lot at work. When he was home, Joyce, a hypochondriac, and she was suffering from depression, demanded constant attention from him, and she spent most of her time in bed. She had even attempted suicide by overdose. Neither parent devoted much time to their son, who later in life recalled extreme tension and numerous arguments between his parents during his earlier years, due to both Lionel's absence and Joyce's paranoia and depression. Dahmer was a very happy child when he was very young, but became notably subdued after a double hernia surgery before his 4th birthday. At elementary school, he was known to be quiet and timid. He didn't have any friends, and teachers noticed signs of abandonment due to his father's absence and his mother's depression, as I just said, and her illnesses, which only worsened when she had gotten pregnant with the second child in October of 1966. The family moved to Doylestown, Ohio, and when Joyce gave birth in December, Dahmer chose the name of his brother, David. At an early age, Dahmer manifested an interest in dead animals, and his fascination with dead animals may have began when, at age 4, he saw his father removing animal bones from beneath the family home. According to Lionel, Dahmer was oddly thrilled by the sound the bones made and became preoccupied with animal bones, which he liked to refer to as fiddlesticks. He occasionally searched around the house for animal bones and explored the bodies of live animals to discover where their bones were located. In May of 1968, the family moved to Bath Township, Summit County, Ohio. This address was their 3rd in 2 years and the Dahmer's 6th address since marriage. The home stood in 1.5 acres of woodland, with a small hut a short walk from the house, where Dahmer began collecting large insects and the skeletons of small animals such as chipmunks and squirrels. Some of these remains were preserved in jars of formaldehyde and stored within the hut. 2 years later, during a chicken dinner, Dahmer asked Lionel what would happen if the chicken bones were placed in bleach. Lionel, pleased by what he believed to be his son's scientific curiosity, demonstrated how to safely bleach and preserve animal bones. Dahmer incorporated these preserving techniques into his bone collecting. He also began collecting dead animals, including roadkill, which he would dissect and bury inside the hut, with the skulls occasionally placed atop makeshift crosses. According to one friend, Dahmer explained that he was curious as to how animals fit together, and in one instance, in 1975, Dahmer decapitated the carcass of a dog before nailing the body to a tree and impaling the skull upon a stick in the woodland behind his house. And as a prank, he later invited a friend to view the display, claiming he had discovered the remains by simple chance. The same year, Lionel taught his son how to preserve animal bones, and Joyce began increasing her daily consumption of Equinol, laxatives, and sleeping pills, further increasing her emotional distance from her family, her husband, and her children. From his freshman year at Revere High School, Dahmer was seen as an outcast. By age 14, he had begun drinking beer and hard alcohol in the daylight hours, frequently concealing his liquor inside his jacket. When a classmate asked why he was drinking whiskey in a morning history class, Dahmer shrugged and said the alcohol was, quote, my medicine, unquote. Although largely uncommunicative, in his freshman year, Dahmer was seen by staff as polite and highly intelligent, but earned only average grades. He was a competitive tennis player and played briefly in the high school band, and when he reached puberty, Dahmer discovered he was gay, but he did not tell his parents. And in his early teens, he had a brief relationship with another teenage boy, although they had never had intercourse. By Dahmer's admission, he began fantasizing about dominating and controlling a completely submissive male partner in his early to mid-teens. And his masturbatory fantasies gradually evolved to his focusing on chests and torsos. These fantasies gradually became intertwined with dissection. When he was about 16 years old, Dahmer conceived a fantasy of rendering unconscious, in particular, a male jogger he found attractive and then making sexual use of his body. On one occasion, Dahmer concealed himself in the bushes with a baseball bat to lie and wait for this man. However, the jogger did not pass by on that particular day, and Dahmer later admitted that this was his first attempt to attack and render an individual submissive to him. Dahmer was known to his high school peers as a class clown who often staged pranks, which became known as doing a Dahmer. By 1977, Dahmer's grades had declined and his parents hired a private tutor with limited success. In the same year, in an attempt to save their marriage, his parents attended counseling sessions, but they had continued to quarrel frequently. When Lionel discovered that Joyce had engaged in a brief affair in September of 1977, they decided to divorce, telling their sons they wished to do so amicably. The process of their divorce soon became increasingly bitter and acrimonious, and Lionel moved out of the house in early 1978, temporarily residing in a motel on North Cleveland Massillon Road. In May of 1978, Dahmer had graduated from high school, and a few weeks before his graduation, one of his teachers observed Dahmer sitting close to the school parking lot, drinking several cans of beer. When the teacher threatened to report the matter, Dahmer informed him he was experiencing a lot of problems at home and that the school's guidance counselor was aware of them. Dahmer had just turned 18 and remained in the family home, so he had the house to himself. Dahmer's parents' divorce was finalized on July 24th, 1978, and Joyce was awarded custody of their younger son and alimony payments. Dahmer committed his first murder in 1978, 3 weeks after his high school graduation. On June 18th, Dahmer had picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Mark Hicks, who was 18 years of age. Hicks, who had been hitchhiking to a rock concert at Chippewa Lake Park, agreed to accompany Dahmer to his house upon the promise of a few beers with Dahmer, who had the house to himself at this point. According to Dahmer, the sight of the bare-chested Hicks standing at the roadside stirred his sexual feelings, although when Hicks began talking about girls, he knew any sexual passes he made would be rebuffed. After several hours of talking, drinking, and listening to music, Hicks, quote, wanted to leave, and I didn't want him to leave, end quote. Dahmer bludgeoned Hicks with a 10-pound dumbbell. He later stated he had struck Hicks twice from behind with the dumbbell as Hicks sat upon a chair. When Hicks fell unconscious, Dahmer strangled him to death with the bar of the dumbbell and then stripped the clothes from Hicks' body before exploring his chest with his hands, and then masturbated as he stood above the corpse. Hours later, Dahmer dragged the body to the basement. The following day, Dahmer dissected Hicks' body in the basement, and he later buried the remains in a shallow grave in his backyard. Several weeks later, he unearthed the remains and removed the flesh from the bones. He dissolved the flesh in acid before flushing the solution down the toilet. He crushed the bones with a sledgehammer and scattered them in the woodland behind the family home. 6 weeks after the murder of Hicks, Dahmer's father and his fiancée returned to his home, where they discovered Dahmer living alone. That August, Dahmer enrolled at Ohio State University, OSU, hoping to major in business. Dahmer's sole term at OSU was completely unproductive. His overall GPA was 0.45. On one occasion, Lionel paid a surprise visit to his son, only to find his dormitory room strewn with empty liquor bottles. And despite his father having paid in advance for the second term, Dahmer dropped out of OSU after just 3 months. In January of 1979, on his father's urging, Dahmer enlisted in the United States Army. He underwent basic training at Fort McClellan in Anniston, Alabama, before training as a medical specialist at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. On July 13, 1979, Dahmer was deployed to Baumholder, West Germany, where he served as a combat medic in the 2nd Battalion, 68th Armored Regiment, 8th Infantry Division. According to published reports in Dahmer's first year of service, he was an average or slightly above average soldier, and owing to Dahmer's alcohol abuse, his performance deteriorated, and in March of 1981, he was deemed unsuitable for military service and was later discharged from the army. He received an honorable discharge, as his superiors did not believe that any problems Dahmer had in the army would be applicable to his civilian life. On March 24th, 1981, Dahmer was sent to Fort Jackson in South Carolina for debriefing and provided with a plane ticket to travel anywhere in the country. Dahmer later told police he felt he could not return home to face his father, so he opted to travel to Miami Beach, Florida, both because he was tired of the cold of Wisconsin and in an attempt to live by his own means. In Florida, Dahmer found a job at a delicatessen and rented a room in a nearby motel. He spent most of his salary on alcohol and was soon evicted from the motel for not paying for his room. Dahmer initially spent his evenings on the beach as he continued to work at the sandwich shop until phoning his father and asking to return to Ohio. 2 weeks after his return, was arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct, and Dahmer's father tried unsuccessfully to wean his son off of alcohol. In December of 1981, he and his second wife sent him to live with his paternal grandmother, Catherine Dahmer, in West Allis, Wisconsin. As she was the only family member to whom Dahmer displayed any positivity or affection, they hoped that both her influence and the change of location might persuade him to stop drinking, find a job, and live responsibly. Initially, Dahmer's living arrangements with his grandmother were harmonious. He accompanied her to church, willingly undertook chores, actively sought work, and abided by most of her house rules, although he continued to smoke and drink. In early 1982, he found employment as a phlebotomist at the Milwaukee Blood Plasma Center. He held this job for a total of 10 months before being laid off. Dahmer remained unemployed for over 2 years, during which he lived upon the money that his grandmother had provided him. Shortly before losing his job, Dahmer was arrested for indecent exposure. On August 8, 1982, at Wisconsin State Fair Park, he was observed exposing himself on the south side of the Coliseum, in which 25 people were present, including women and children, and for this incident, he was convicted and fined $50. In January 1985, Dahmer was hired as a mixer at the Milwaukee Ambrosia Chocolate Factory, where he worked from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 6 nights per week, with Saturday evenings off. By late 1985, Dahmer had begun to regularly frequent the bathhouses, which he later described as being relaxing places, but during his sexual encounters, he became frustrated at his partners moving during the act. And following his arrest, he stated, "I trained myself to view people as objects of pleasure instead of as people." And for this reason, beginning in June 1986, he administered sleeping pills to his partners, giving them liquor laced with sedatives. He then waited for his partner to fall asleep before performing various sexual acts, and to maintain an adequate supply of his medication, Dahmer informed doctors he worked nights and required the tablets to adjust to that schedule. After approximately 12 such instances, the bathhouse's administration revoked Dahmer's membership, and he began to use hotel rooms to continue this practice. Shortly after his memberships were revoked, Dahmer read a report in a newspaper regarding the upcoming funeral of an 18-year-old male. He conceived the idea of stealing the fresh corpse and taking it home. According to Dahmer, he attempted to dig up the coffin from the ground but found the soil too hard and abandoned the plan. On September 8, 1986, Dahmer was arrested upon a charge of lewd behavior for masturbating in the presence of two 12-year-old boys as he stood close to the Kinnickinnic River. He initially claimed he had merely been urinating, unaware that there were witnesses, but soon admitted to the offense. The charge was changed to disorderly conduct, and on March 10, 1987, Dahmer was sentenced to 1 year of probation with additional instructions to undergo counseling. On November 20th, 1987, Dahmer, at the time still residing with his grandmother, encountered a 25-year-old man from Ontonagon, Michigan, named Stephen Tuomi at a bar and persuaded him to return to the Ambassador Hotel in Milwaukee, where Dahmer had rented a room for the evening. According to Dahmer, he had no intention of killing Tuomi, but intended to simply drug him and lie beside him as he explored his body. The following morning, Dahmer awoke to find Tuomi lying beneath him on the bed, his chest crushed in and black and blue with bruises. Blood was seeping from the corner of his mouth, and Dahmer's fists and one forearm were extensively bruised. Dahmer later said that he had no memory of killing Tuomi, and that he could not believe that that had happened. Dahmer purchased a large suitcase in which he transported Tuomi's body to his grandmother's residence, and 1 week later he severed the head, arms, and legs, then filleted the bones from the body before cutting the flesh into pieces small enough to handle. Dahmer placed the flesh inside plastic garbage bags, and he wrapped the bones inside a sheet and pounded them into splinters with a sledgehammer. The dismemberment process took Dahmer approximately 2 hours, and he disposed of all of Tuomi's remains, excluding the head, in the trash. I hope you know I am going to be gagging this entire video. I'm gonna cut it all out, but just behind the scenes, I am gagging up a fucking storm. For 2 weeks following Tuomi's killing, Dahmer retained Tuomi's head wrapped in a blanket, and after 2 weeks, Dahmer boiled the head in a mixture of Soliax, an alkali-based industrial detergent, and bleach in an effort to retain the skull, which he then used as stimulus for masturbation. Eventually, the skull became too brittle by this bleaching process, so Dahmer had pulverized and disposed of it. According to Dahmer, Tuomi's murder was a pivotal incident after which he did not try to control his compulsions. He began to actively seek victims, most of whom he encountered in or around gay bars, and would typically lure them to his grandmother's home, before or shortly after engaging in sexual activity. Once his victim was unconscious, he strangled them to death. 2 weeks after the Tuomi killing, Dahmer encountered a 14-year-old Native American prostitute, James Doxtator. Dahmer lured him to his grandmother's residence with an offer of $50 to pose for nude pictures, and they engaged in sexual activity before Dahmer drugged Doxtator and strangled him on the floor of the cellar. Dahmer left the body in the cellar for 1 week before dismembering it, in much the same manner as he had with Tuomi. Placed all of Doxtator's remains, excluding the skull, in the trash, and the skull was boiled and cleansed in bleach before Dahmer found that it, too, had been rendered brittle by this process, and he pulverized the skull 2 weeks later. On March 24th, 1988, Dahmer met a 22-year-old bisexual man, Richard Guerrero, outside a gay bar called the Phoenix. Dahmer lured Guerrero to his grandmother's residence, offering him $50 to spend the night with him. He drugged Guerrero with sleeping pills, strangled him with a leather strap, and performed oral sex on the corpse. Dahmer dismembered Guerrero's body within 24 hours, again disposing of the remains in the trash and retaining the skull before pulverizing it several months later. On April 2nd, Dahmer encountered 25-year-old Ronald Douglas Flowers Jr. at a payphone outside a gay bar. Flowers was lured to Dahmer's grandmother's house on the pretense of Dahmer obtaining cables to recharge the battery of Flowers' stranded vehicle. However, after giving Flowers a drugged coffee, both he and Flowers heard Dahmer's grandmother call, "Is that you, Jeff?" Although Dahmer replied in a manner that led his grandmother to believe he was alone, she observed that he was not alone. And after Flowers became unconscious, Dahmer decided not to kill him. And hours later, while Flowers was still largely incoherent, Dahmer walked him to a bus stop where he left him. Flowers later woke in the County General Hospital with visible bruise marks upon his neck, and later discovered his underwear were inside out. In September of 1988, Dahmer's grandmother asked him to move out, largely because of his drinking, his habit of bringing young men to her house late at night, and the foul smells emanating from the basement and the garage. Dahmer found a 1-bedroom apartment at 808 North 24th Street and moved into the residence on September 25th. 2 days later, he was arrested for drugging and sexually fondling a 13-year-old boy, whom he had lured to his home on the pretext of posing nude for photographs. Dahmer's father hired attorney Gerald Boyle to defend his son, and at Boyle's request, Dahmer underwent a series of psychological evaluations prior to his court hearings. The evaluations found that Dahmer harbored deep feelings of alienation, and a second evaluation 2 months later revealed Dahmer to be an impulsive individual, suspicious of others, and dismayed by his lack of accomplishments in life. On January 30th, 1989, Dahmer pleaded guilty to the charges of second-degree sexual assault and of enticing a child for immoral purposes. Sentencing was suspended until May, and on March 20th, Dahmer commenced a 10-day Easter absence from work, during which he moved back into his grandmother's home. 2 months after his conviction and 2 months prior to his sentencing, Dahmer murdered his 5th victim, a 24-year-old mixed-race aspiring model, Anthony Sears, whom he met at a gay bar on March 25th, 1989. According to Dahmer, on this particular occasion, he was not looking to commit a crime. However, shortly before closing time that evening, Sears just started talking to me. Dahmer lured Sears to his grandmother's home, where the pair engaged in oral sex before Dahmer drugged and strangled Sears. The following morning, Dahmer placed the corpse in his grandmother's bathtub, where he decapitated the body before attempting to fillet the corpse. He stripped the flesh from the body and pulverized the bones, which he disposed of in the trash. According to Dahmer, he found Sears exceptionally attractive, and Sears was the first victim from whom he permanently retained any body parts. He preserved Sears' head and genitalia in acetone and stored them in a wooden box, which he later placed in his work locker. When he moved to a new address the following year, he took the remains there. On May 23rd, 1989, Dahmer was sentenced to 5 years probation and 1 year in the House of Correction with work release permitted so he could keep his job. He was also required to register as a sex offender, and 2 months before his scheduled release, Dahmer was paroled from this regimen. His 5 years probation, imposed in 1989, began at this point, and Dahmer temporarily moved back to his grandmother's home in West Allis. On May 14, 1990, Dahmer moved out of his grandmother's house and into 924 North 25th Street, apartment 213, taking Sears' mummified head and genitals with him. Although located in a high-crime area, Dahmer's new apartment was close to his workplace, was furnished, and at $300 per month inclusive of all bills excluding electricity, was economical. Within 1 week of his moving to this address, Dahmer killed his 6th victim, Raymond Smith. Smith was a 32-year-old prostitute who Dahmer had lured to his apartment with the promise of $50 for sex. And inside the apartment, he gave Smith a drink laced with 7 sleeping pills, and then he proceeded to strangle him. The following day, Dahmer purchased a Polaroid camera with which he took several pictures of Smith's body in suggestive positions before dismembering him in the bathroom. He boiled the legs, arms, and pelvis in a steel kettle with Soilax, which allowed him to rinse the bones in the sink. Dahmer dissolved the remainder of Smith's skeleton. Oh god, this is hard, excluding the skull, in a container filled with acid. He later spray painted Smith's skull, which he placed alongside the skull of Sears upon a black towel inside a filing cabinet. In June of 1990, Dahmer lured a 27-year-old acquaintance, Edward Smith, to his apartment, where he drugged and strangled him. On this occasion, rather than immediately acidifying the skeleton or repeating previous processes of bleaching, which had rendered previous victims' skulls brittle, Dahmer placed Smith's skeleton in his freezer for several months in the hope it would not retain moisture. Freezing the skeleton did not remove moisture, and the skeleton of this victim was acidified several months later. Dahmer accidentally destroyed the skull when he placed it in the oven to dry, a process that caused the skull to explode. Dahmer later informed the police he had felt rotten about Smith's murder, as he had been unable to retain any parts of his body. Quote, "It was my way of remembering their appearance, their physical beauty I also wanted to keep. If I couldn't keep them there with me whole, I at least could keep their skeletons," unquote. Jeffrey Dahmer recollecting his motivations for both photographing his victims and retaining sections of their skeletal fracture, February 1993. Less than 3 months after the murder of Edward Smith, Dahmer encountered a 22-year-old Chicago native named Ernest Miller outside a bookstore on the corner of North 27th Street. Miller agreed to accompany Dahmer to his apartment for $50 and further agreed to allow him to listen to his heart and stomach. When Dahmer attempted to perform oral sex upon Miller, he was informed, "That'll cost you extra." Whereupon Dahmer gave Miller a drink laced with 2 sleeping pills, and on this occasion, Dahmer had only 2 sleeping pills to give his victim. He used the rest of them. Therefore, he killed Miller by slashing an artery with the same knife he used to dissect his victims' bodies. Miller bled to death within minutes, and Dahmer then posed the nude body for various suggestive Polaroid photographs before placing it in his bathtub for dismemberment. I unfortunately have seen the Polaroids. I actually was looking at them last night when I was making the script, and I've seen them before last night, obviously, but they just affect me, man. Shit's disgusting what he did to those people. If you want to look at them, do that out of your own accord, okay? Go look them up if you want to, but beware. I am not going to sit here and tell my audience to go look at the Jeffrey Dahmer Polaroids. They are fucking horrific. It's hard to look at, and they don't leave your brain either. No, they don't leave your brain. They are all I've been picturing while sitting here recording this video. They're all I can think about. I highly don't recommend it. Yeah, don't recommend it. Dahmer repeatedly kissed and talked to the severed head while he dismembered the remainder of the body. Okay, I'm gonna try to get through this next part without literally throwing up all over the place. Dahmer wrapped Miller's heart, liver, biceps, and portions of flesh from the legs in plastic bags and placed them in the freezer for later consumption. Oh! For later consumption. He boiled the remaining flesh. What the He boiled the remaining flesh and organs into a jelly-like substance. Oh wow, this one is rough. This is a rough episode. Using Soilax, which enabled him to rinse the flesh off the skeleton, which he intended to retain. I'm jump cutting through all of my gagging, so if I look like I'm crying, I'm not. I'm gagging. I'm gagging. Okay, I'm gagging. Oh god. I wouldn't be gagging if I didn't know what it looked like. But because I have seen the Polaroids, this is hard. This is hard to get through. I need to put my big true crime girl panties on. To preserve the skeleton, Dahmer placed the bones in a light bleach solution for 24 hours before allowing them to dry upon a cloth for 1 week. The severed head was initially placed in the refrigerator before being stripped of flesh, before being painted and coated with enamel. 3 weeks after the murder of Miller, on September 24th, Dahmer encountered a 22-year-old father of 2 named David Thomas at the Grand Avenue Mall. He persuaded him to return to his apartment for a few drinks, with additional money on offer if he would pose for photographs. And in his statement to police after his arrest, Dahmer said that after giving Thomas a drink laden with sedatives, he did not feel attracted to him, but was afraid to allow him to awaken, fearing that he would be angry over having been drugged. Therefore, he strangled him and dismembered the body, intentionally retaining no body parts whatsoever. He photographed the dismemberment process and retained these photographs. Following the murder of Thomas, Dahmer did not kill anyone for almost 5 months. Although on a minimum of 5 occasions between October 1990 and February 1991, he unsuccessfully attempted to lure men to his apartment. He regularly complained of feelings of both anxiety and depression to his probation officer throughout 1990, with frequent references to his sexuality, his solitary lifestyle, financial difficulties, and shortly before Thanksgiving, his apprehension regarding meeting and facing his father and younger brother, David. In February of 1991, Dahmer observed a 17-year-old named Curtis Strouder standing at a bus stop near Marquette University, and according to Dahmer, he lured Strouder into his apartment with an offer of money for posing for nude photos, with the added incentive of sexual intercourse. Dahmer drugged Strouder, cuffed his hands behind his back, and then strangled him to death with a leather strap. He then dismembered Strouder, taking his skull, hands, and genitals, and photographing each stage of the dismemberment process. And I believe that I have seen these photos. Less than 2 months later, on April 7th, Dahmer encountered a 19-year-old named Errol Lindsay walking to get a key cut, and Dahmer lured Lindsay to his apartment where he drugged him and then drilled a hole in his skull, through which he injected hydrochloric acid with a baster, and according to Dahmer, Lindsay awoke after this experiment, which Dahmer had conceived in the hope of inducing a permanent, unresistant, submissive state, saying, "I have a headache. What time is it?" And in response to this, Dahmer again drugged Lindsay, and then strangled him. He decapitated Lindsay and retained his skull. He then filleted Lindsay's body, placing the skin in a solution of cold water and salt for several weeks in the hope of permanently retaining it. Reluctantly, he disposed of Lindsay's skin when he noted it had become too frayed and brittle. By 1991, fellow residents of the Oxford apartments had repeatedly complained of the building's manager, Sopa Princewell, the foul smells emanating from apartment 213, in addition to the sounds of falling objects and the occasional sounds of a chainsaw. Princewell contacted Dahmer in response to these complaints on several occasions, although he initially excused the odors emanating from his apartment as being caused by his freezer breaking, causing the contents to become spoiled. And on later occasions, he informed Princewell that the reason for the resurgence of the odor was that several of his tropical fish had recently died, and that he would take care of the matter. On May 24th, 1991, Dahmer encountered a 31-year-old aspiring model and deaf man, Tony Hughes, at a nightclub. He was lured to Dahmer's apartment with an offer of money to pose for photographs, and Hughes was drugged into unconsciousness before Dahmer injected hydrochloric acid into his skull in an effort to disable his will and render him submissive, although on this occasion, the drilling and injection proved fatal. I talked about this briefly in my video on Saturday. On the afternoon of May 26, 1991, Dahmer encountered a 14-year-old Lao teenager, Conrad Synthasmophone, on Wisconsin Avenue. Unknown to Dahmer, Synthasmophone was the younger brother of a boy that he had molested in 1988. Dahmer offered him money to accompany him to his apartment to pose for Polaroid pictures, and according to Dahmer, he was initially reluctant to the proposal, before changing his mind and accompanying him to his apartment, where he posed for 2 pictures in his underwear before Dahmer drugged him into unconsciousness and performed oral sex on him. Before Synthasmophone fell unconscious, Dahmer led the boy into his bedroom, where the body of Tony Hughes, whom Dahmer had killed 3 days earlier, lay naked on the floor. According to Dahmer, he believed that Synthasmophone saw this body yet did not react to seeing the bloated corpse, likely because of the effects of the sleeping pills he had ingested. On this occasion, Dahmer drilled a single narrow hole into the crown of Synthasmophone's skull, through which he injected hydrochloric acid into the frontal lobe. Dahmer then drank several beers while lying alongside Synthasmophone before briefly falling asleep, and then leaving his apartment to drink at a bar and purchase more alcohol. In the early morning hours of May 27th, Dahmer returned to his apartment to discover Synthasmophone sitting naked on the corner of 25th and State, talking in Lao with 3 distressed young women standing near him. Dahmer approached the women and told them that Synthasmophone, whom he referred to by the alias John Hamong, was his friend, and attempted to lead him to his apartment by the arm. The 3 women dissuaded Dahmer, explaining they had phoned 911. Upon the arrival of 2 Milwaukee police officers, John Balkerzak and Joseph Gabrish, Dahmer's demeanor relaxed, and he told the officers that Synthasmophone was his 19-year-old boyfriend, that he had drunk too much following a quarrel, and that he frequently behaved in this manner when intoxicated. Dahmer added his lover had consumed Jack Daniels whiskey that evening. Shortly after the arrival of the Milwaukee police officers, 3 members of the Milwaukee Fire Department arrived at the scene. These individuals also examined Synthasmophone for injuries and provided a yellow blanket for the police officers to cover him. One of the 3 believed Synthasmophone needed treatment, but the police officers directed the fire department personnel to leave. Shortly thereafter, Officer Richard Porobkin arrived at the scene. He had Gabrish, followed by Balkerzak, escorted Dahmer and Synthasmophone to Dahmer's apartment, as Dahmer repeatedly commented on the general crime in the neighborhood and of his appreciation of the police. By the way, I just want to say, if you... And I am going to put a little disclaimer up before the video really starts. If you need to take breaks from watching this, I totally get it. I totally get it. I'm sick to my stomach. So, I understand. This shit is rough. Take breaks, come back. If it's too much, don't come back. But I understand. Inside his apartment, and in an effort to verify his claim that he and Synthasmophone were lovers, Dahmer showed the officers the 2 semi-nude Polaroid pictures he had taken of Synthasmophone the previous evening. Though Balkerzak said he smelled nothing unusual, Gabrish later stated he noted a strange scent reminiscent of excrement inside the apartment. The odor emanated from the decomposing body of Hughes. Dahmer stated that to investigate this odor, one officer simply peeked his head around the bedroom, but really didn't take a good look. The officers then left with a departing remark that Dahmer take good care of synthasmophone, and this incident was listed by the officers as a domestic dispute. Dahmer again injected hydrochloric acid into synthasmophone's brain. The second injection proved fatal, and the following day, May 28th, Dahmer took a day's leave from work to devote himself to the dismemberment of the bodies of synthasmophone and Hughes. He retained both victims' skulls. On June 30th, Dahmer traveled to Chicago, where he encountered 20-year-old Matt Turner at a bus station. Turner accepted Dahmer's offer to travel to Milwaukee for a professional photo shoot, and at the apartment, Dahmer drugged, strangled, and dismembered Turner and placed his head and internal organs in separate bags in the freezer. Turner was not reported missing. 5 days later, on July 5th, Dahmer lured 23-year-old Jeremiah Weinberger from a Chicago bar to his apartment on the promise of spending the weekend with him. He drugged Weinberger and twice injected boiling water through his skull, sending him into a coma from which he died 2 days later. On July 15, Dahmer encountered 24-year-old Oliver Lacey at the corner of 27th and Kilbourne. Lacey agreed to Dahmer's ruse of posing nude for photographs and accompanied him to his apartment, where the pair engaged in tentative sexual activity before Dahmer drugged Lacey. On this occasion, Dahmer intended to prolong the time he spent with Lacey while alive. After unsuccessfully attempting to render Lacey unconscious with chloroform, he phoned his workplace to request a day's absence. This was granted, although the next day he was suspended. After strangling Lacey, Dahmer had sex with the corpse before dismembering him, placed Lacey's head and heart in the refrigerator, and his skeleton in the freezer. 4 days later, on July 19th, Dahmer received word that he was dismissed from his job. Upon receipt of this news, Dahmer lured 25-year-old Joseph Braidhoft to his apartment. Braidhoft was strangled and left lying on Dahmer's bed covered with a sheet for 2 days. On July 21st, Dahmer removed the sheet to find the head covered in maggots. Oh, God. He decapitated the body, cleaned the head, and placed it in the refrigerator. He later acidified Braidhoft's torso, along with those of 2 other victims killed within the previous month. On July 22nd, 1991, Dahmer approached 3 men with an offer of $100 to accompany him to his apartment to pose for nude photographs, drink beer, and simply keep him company. Only one of the 3 men, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards, agreed to accompany him to his apartment, and upon entering Dahmer's apartment, Edwards noted a foul odor and several boxes of hydrochloric acid on the floor, which Dahmer claimed to use for cleaning bricks, and after some minor conversation, Edwards responded to Dahmer's request to turn his head and view his tropical fish, whereupon Dahmer handcuffed him. When Edwards asked what's happening, Dahmer unsuccessfully attempted to cuff his wrists together and then told Edwards to accompany him to the bedroom to pose for nude pictures. While inside the bedroom, Edwards noticed nude male posters on the wall and that a videotape of The Exorcist 3 was playing. He also noticed a blue 57-gallon drum in the corner from which a strong odor emanated. Dahmer then brandished a knife and informed Edwards he intended to take nude pictures of him. In an attempt to appease Dahmer, Edwards unbuttoned his shirt, saying he would allow him to do so if he would remove the handcuffs and put the knife away. In response to this promise, Dahmer simply turned his attention towards the TV. Edwards observed Dahmer rocking back and forth and chanting before turning his attention back to him. He placed his head on Edwards' chest, listened to his heartbeat, and with the knife pressed against his intended victim, informed Edwards he intended to eat his heart. In an effort to prevent Dahmer from attacking him, Edwards repeated that he was Dahmer's friend and that he was not going to run away. Edwards has decided he was going to either jump from a window or run through the unlocked front door upon the next available opportunity, and when Edwards stated he needed to use the bathroom, he asked if they could sit with a beer in the living room, where there was air conditioning. Dahmer consented, and the pair walked to the living room when Edwards exited the bathroom, and inside the living room, Edwards waited until he observed Dahmer having a momentary lapse of concentration before requesting to use the bathroom again. When Edwards rose from the couch, he noted Dahmer was not holding the handcuffs, whereupon Edwards punched him in the face, knocking Dahmer off balance and ran out the front door. At 11:30 on July 22nd, Edwards flagged down 2 Milwaukee police officers, Robert Routh and Rolf Mueller. The officers noted Edwards had a handcuff attached to his wrist, whereupon he explained to the officers that a freak had placed the handcuffs upon him and asked if the police could remove them. When the officers' handcuff keys failed to fit the brand of handcuffs, Edwards agreed to accompany the officers to the apartment where Edwards stated he had spent the previous 5 hours before escaping. Trigger warning for the entire episode, but trigger warning for this next part especially. When the officers and Edwards arrived at apartment 213, Dahmer invited the trio inside and acknowledged he had placed the handcuffs upon Edwards, although he offered no explanation as to why he had done so. At this point, Edwards divulged into the officers that Dahmer had also brandished a large knife upon him, and that this had happened in the bedroom. Dahmer made no comment to this revelation, indicating to Mueller that the key to the handcuffs was in his bedside dresser. As Mueller entered the bedroom, Dahmer attempted to pass Mueller to retrieve the key himself, whereupon the second officer present, Routh, informed him to back off. In the bedroom, Mueller noted that there was a large knife beneath the bed. He saw an open drawer that, upon closer inspection, contained scores of Polaroid pictures, many of which were of human bodies in various stages of dismemberment. Mueller noted the decor indicated they had been taken in the same apartment in which they were standing. He walked into the living room to show them to his partner, uttering the words, "These are for real." When Dahmer saw that Mueller was holding several of his Polaroids, he fought with the officers in an effort to resist arrest. The officers quickly overpowered him, cuffed his hands behind his back, and called a second squad car for backup. At this point, Mueller opened the refrigerator to reveal the freshly severed head of a black male on the bottom shelf. As Dahmer lay pinned on the floor beneath Routh, he turned his head towards the officers and muttered the words, "For what I did, I should be dead." A more detailed search of the apartment conducted by the Milwaukee Police's Criminal Investigation Bureau revealed a total of 4 severed heads in Dahmer's kitchen. A total of 7 skulls, some painted, some bleached, were found in Dahmer's bedroom and inside a closet. Investigators discovered collected blood drippings upon a tray at the bottom of Dahmer's refrigerator, plus 2 human hearts and a portion of arm muscle, each wrapped inside plastic bags upon the shelves. In Dahmer's freezer, investigators discovered an entire torso, plus a bag of human organs and flesh stuck to the ice at the bottom. Elsewhere in the apartment, investigators discovered 2 entire skeletons, a pair of severed hands, 2 severed and preserved penises, a mummified scalp, and in the 57-gallon drum, 3 further dismembered torsos dissolving in the acid solution. A total of 74 Polaroid pictures detailing the dismemberment of Dahmer's victims were found. These are the Polaroids that I was referencing before. In reference to the recovery of body parts and artifacts at 924 North 25th Street, the chief medical examiner later stated it was more like dismantling someone's museum than an actual crime scene. Beginning in the early hours of July 23, 1991, Dahmer was questioned by Detective Patrick Kennedy as to the murders he had committed and the evidence found at his apartment. Over the following 2 weeks, Kennedy and later Detective Dennis Murphy conducted numerous interviews with Dahmer, which, when combined, totaled over 60 hours, with the detectives ultimately compiling a 178-page confession. Dahmer waived his right to have a lawyer present throughout his interrogations, adding he wished to confess all as he had created this horror, and it only makes sense I do everything to put an end to it. He readily admitted to having murdered 16 young men in Wisconsin since 1987, with one further victim, Stephen Hicks, killed in Ohio in 1978. Dahmer readily admitted to engaging in necrophilia with several of his victims' bodies, including performing sexual acts with their internal organs as he dismembered their bodies in his bathtub. Having noted that much of the blood pooled inside his victim's chest after death, Dahmer first removed their internal organs and then suspended the torso so the blood drained into his bathtub. Before dicing any organs he did not wish to retain and paring the flesh from the body. The bones he wished to dispose of were pulverized or acidified with Soilax and bleach solutions used to aid in the preservation of the skulls and skeletons he wished to keep. Dahmer confessed to having consumed the hearts, liver, biceps, and portions of thigh of 3 victims he had killed. at the Oxford Apartments, Raymond Smith, Ernest Miller, and Oliver Lacey, and to have retained the flesh and organs of other victims for intended consumption. Typically, Dahmer would tenderize the body parts he intended to consume prior to preparing meals flavored with various condiments. Referencing his reasons for consuming his victims, Dahmer stated he had initially consumed portions of his victims due to curiosity, before adding, "I suppose, in an odd way, it made me feel they were even more permanent part of me." Describing the increase in the rate of his killing prior to his arrest, Dahmer stated he had been completely swept along with his compulsion to kill, adding, "It was an incessant and never-ending desire to be with someone at whatever cost. Someone good-looking, really nice-looking. It just filled my thoughts all day long." When asked as to why he had preserved a total of 7 skulls and the entire skeletons of 2 victims, Dahmer stated he had been in the process of constructing a private altar of victim skulls, which he had intended to display on the black table located in his living room, and upon which he had photographed the bodies of many of his victims. This display of skulls was to be adorned at each side of the complete skeletons of Miller and Lacey. The 4 severed heads found in his kitchen were to have all flesh removed and used in his altar, as was the skull of at least one future victim. Incense sticks were to be placed at each end of the black table, above which Dahmer intended to place a large blue lamp with extending blue globe lights, and the entire construction was to be placed before a window covered with a black opaque shower curtain, in front of which Dahmer intended to sit in a black leather chair. When asked in a November 18, 1991 interview to whom the altar was dedicated, Dahmer replied, "Myself, it was a place where I could feel at home." He further described his intended altar as a place for meditation, from where he believed he could draw a sense of power, adding, if this, his arrest, had happened 6 months later, that's what they would have found. And on July 25th, 1991, Dahmer was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. By August 22nd, he had been charged with a further 11 murders committed in Wisconsin, and on September 14th, investigators in Ohio, having uncovered hundreds of bone fragments and woodland behind the address in which Dahmer had confessed to killing his first victim, formally identified 2 molars and a vertebrae with X-ray records of Hicks. 3 days later, Dahmer was charged by authorities in Ohio with Hicks' murder. Dahmer was not charged with the attempted murder of Edwards nor with the murder of Tuomi. He was not charged with Tuomi's murder because the district attorney only brought charges where murder could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and Dahmer had no memory of actually committing this particular murder, for which no physical evidence of the crime existed. At a scheduled preliminary hearing on January 13th, 1992, Dahmer pleaded guilty but insane to 15 counts of murder. Dahmer's trial began on January 30th, 1992. He was tried in Milwaukee for the 15 counts of first-degree murder before Judge Lawrence Graham. By pleading guilty on January 13th to the charges brought against him, Dahmer had waived his rights to a trial to establish guilt, as defined in Wisconsin law. Attorneys at Dahmer's trial debated whether he suffered from either a mental or personality disorder. The prosecution claimed that any disorders did not deprive Dahmer of the ability to appreciate the criminality of his conduct or to deprive him of the ability to resist his impulses. The defense argued that Dahmer suffered from a mental disease and was driven by obsessions and impulses he was unable to control. Defense experts argued that Dahmer was insane due to his necrophilic drive. His compulsion to have sexual encounters with corpses. Defense expert Fred Berlin testified that Dahmer was unable to conform his conduct at the time that he committed the crimes due to his paraphilia, or specifically necrophilia. On February 8th, a psychiatrist, Dr. Fred Fosdal, testified on behalf of the prosecution. Fosdal testified to his belief that Dahmer was without mental disease or defect at the time he committed the murders. He described Dahmer as a calculating and cunning individual, able to differentiate between right and wrong, with the ability to control his actions, and whose lust overpowered his morals. Although Fosdal did state his belief that Dahmer was a paraphiliac, his conclusion was that Dahmer was not a sadist. He only has to drink alcohol to overcome it because he is inhibited against killing. Dahmer prepared a statement read in front of a judge and the defense. In the statement, Dahmer emphasized that he had never desired freedom following his arrest and that he frankly wished for his own death. He further stressed that none of his murders had been motivated by hatred, that he understood that nothing he either said or did could undo the terrible harm he had caused to the families of his victims and the city of Milwaukee. and that he and his doctors believed his criminal behavior had been motivated by mental disorders. Dahmer added that this medical knowledge had given him some peace, and that, although he understood the society would never forgive him, he hoped God would. Dahmer closed his statement with, "I know my time in prison will be terrible, but I deserve whatever I get because of what I have done. Thank you, Your Honor, and I am prepared for your sentence, which I know will be the maximum. I ask for no consideration." He then returned to his seat to await formal sentencing. Dahmer was then sentenced to life imprisonment plus 10 years upon the first 2 accounts. The remaining 13 counts carried a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment plus 70 years. The death penalty was not an option for Judge Graham to consider at the penalty phase, as Wisconsin had abolished capital punishment in 1853. Upon hearing of Dahmer's sentencing, his father Lionel and stepmother Sherry requested to be allowed a 10-minute private meeting with their son before he was transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage to begin his sentence. This request was granted, and the trio exchanged hugs and well wishes before Dahmer was escorted away. 3 months after his conviction in Milwaukee, Dahmer was extradited to Ohio to be tried for the murder of his first victim, Stephen Hicks. In a court hearing lasting just 45 minutes, Dahmer again pleaded guilty to the charges and was sentenced to a 16th term of life imprisonment on May 1st, 1992. Upon sentencing, Dahmer was transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution, and for the first year of his incarceration, Dahmer was placed in solitary confinement due to concerns for his physical safety should he come into contact with fellow inmates. He received ample correspondence from individuals around the world, with several individuals donating money, which he spent on items such as cassette recordings, stationery, cigarettes, and magazines. Upon Dahmer's request, after 1 year of solitary confinement, he was transferred to a less secure unit, where he was assigned a 2-hour daily work detail cleaning the toilet block. This work detail later expanded to include cleaning the prison gymnasium. Shortly after completing his lengthy confessions in 1991, Dahmer had requested to Detective Murphy that he be given a copy of the Bible. This request was granted, and Dahmer gradually devoted himself to Christianity and became a born-again Christian. On his father's urging, he also read creationist books from the Institute for Creation Research. In May of 1994, Dahmer was baptized by Roy Ratcliffe, a minister in the Church of Christ and a graduate of Oklahoma Christian University, whom he had met on April 20th. This service was conducted in the prison whirlpool. On July 3rd, 1994, a fellow inmate, Osvaldo Dorothy, attempted to slash Dahmer's throat with a razor embedded in a toothbrush as Dahmer sat in the prison chapel after the weekly church service was concluded. Dahmer received superficial wounds and was not seriously hurt in this incident. According to Dahmer's family, he had been long ready to die and accepted any punishment which he might endure in prison. In addition to his father and stepmother maintaining regular contact, Dahmer's mother, Joyce, also remained in regular contact with her son. Prior to his arrest, the two had not seen each other since Christmas 1983. Joyce related that in her weekly phone calls, whenever she expressed concerns for her son's physical well-being, Dahmer responded with the comments to the effect of, "It doesn't matter. I don't care if something happens to me." On the morning of November 28, 1994, Dahmer left his cell to conduct his assigned work detail. Accompanying him were 2 fellow inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. The trio were left unsupervised in the showers of the prison gym for approximately 20 minutes. At approximately 8:10 a.m., Dahmer was discovered on the floor of the bathrooms of the gym with extreme head wounds. He had been severely bludgeoned about the head and face with a 20-inch metal bar. His head had also been repeatedly struck against the wall in the assault, and although Dahmer was still alive and was rushed to a nearby hospital, he was pronounced dead 1 hour later. Anderson had been beaten with the same instrument, and he died from his wounds 2 days later. Scarver, who was serving a life sentence for a murder committed in 1990, informed authorities he had first attacked Dahmer with a metal bar as Dahmer was cleaning a staff locker room, before attacking Anderson as Anderson cleaned an inmate locker room. According to Scarver, Dahmer did not yell or make any noise as he was attacked, and immediately after attacking both men, Scarver, who was thought to be schizophrenic, returned to his cell and informed a prison guard, "God told me to do it. Jesse Anderson and Jeffrey Dahmer are dead." Scarver was adamant he had not planned the attacks in advance, although he later divulged to the investigators he had concealed the 20-inch iron bar used to kill both men in his clothing shortly before the killings. According to Scarver, Dahmer's final words were, "I don't care if I live or die. go ahead and kill me. As far as the aftermath, some of the families were happy, some of them weren't. Some of them wished that he had to live with what they had to live with. And the Oxford apartments were knocked down. They're not standing anymore, and there's nothing on top of them. Now, before I end the video, I will go on to name and honor all of Dahmer's victims. June 18th, 1978, Stephen Hicks, aged 18. November 20th, 1987, Stephen Tuomi, aged 25. January 16th, 1988, James Edward Doxtator, aged 14. March 24th, 1988, Richard Guerrero, aged 22. March 25th, 1989, Anthony Lee Sears, age 24. May 20th, 1990, Ray Lamont Smith, age 32. June 14th, 1990, Edward Warren Smith, age 27. September 2nd, 1990, Ernest Marquez Miller, age 22. September 24th, 1990, David Courtney Thomas, age 22. February 18th, 1991, Curtis Stratter, age 17. April 7th, 1991, Errol Lindsay, age 19. May 24th, 1991, Tony Anthony Hughes, age 31. May 27th, 1991, Connor Xanthasmaphone, age 14. June 30th, 1991, Matt Cleveland Turner, age 20. July 5th, 1991, Jeremiah Benjamin Weinberger, age 23. July 15th, 1991, Oliver Joseph Lacey, age 24. July 19th, 1991, Joseph Arthur Breithoff, age 25. And, well, that concludes the Jeffrey Dahmer case. I hope all his victims rest in peace. I hope the families are doing okay. I don't know how you could live through something like that. I have been recording for 2 hours now. I am gonna go and take a little mental health break because this was a lot. Thank you for watching. Please do subscribe, and I will see you on Saturday.